In the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful.
During history of mankind, many people have claimed to be prophets, some for political motivations. How do we know who is a true prophet or not? And how do we even know prophets even existed?
Assalamu alaikum. These are pretty epic questions. And so it's kind of hard to answer in a minute. And I can point you to some essential ideas, but they each kind of require a discussion. First and foremost, yes, there have been people that claim to be prophets, and we're warned about them in Islam also. And as a matter of fact, the Quran, in a good chunk of the Quran, 2/3 of the Quran is early revelation. You could call it early revelation. And it's predominantly addressing an audience that's not so sure that the man they're talking to is a prophet. So it's a dialogue happening between God and a disbelieving people through the mouth of a messenger, an oral message. I want you to visualize what's happening here. A speech is being delivered by God, and the vessel of that speech is His messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. May peace and blessings of Allah be upon him and his family. And that man, the one who's skeptical about him, doesn't see God, doesn't see a book coming down from the sky. All he hears is words coming out of his mouth. That's all he sees. So he says, how am I supposed to know that these words that you're saying belong to God? But interestingly, in our faith, what's happening is this conversation is actually happening not between the Prophet and the people, but as a matter of fact, between Allah Himself and the people. And Allah hears carefully what they have to say, and then turns around to His messenger and says, well, they ask you this, counter with this, ask them this, question them about this. And so there are a few counter arguments that are mentioned in the Quran as they raise their skepticisms about the Prophet's validity as a man that receives revelation. Now, of the criticisms they made, the things that made them doubtful, number one was, why would it be a human being? And if we really deserve guidance, it should have been an angel or something that came down. Well, you're just a human being like us. You walk around, you go, and they said this about Isa alayhi salam, about Jesus, يَمْشِي فِي الْأَسْوَاقِ يَأْكُلُ الطَّعَامُ وَيَمْشِي فِي الْأَسْوَاقِ. He goes and eats food too, and we've seen him shopping too. Oh my God, he's just like us. What are you talking about? He's a prophet. He receives revelation. How can that be? And the Quran's response to that is very interesting. And I'm summarizing from various places. Essentially, human beings have a problem with authority, especially if they see the other as no different than themselves. And the first question they like to ask is, what makes you so special? And this began with the devil himself. What's so special about Adam? What's he got? Why do I have to accept that he is chosen for any reason? I refuse. So the attitude this problem isn't so much a philosophical one as it is a psychological one. I just don't like people having authority or being special over me somehow. This is the same problem as the brothers of Yusuf alayhi salam, have with him. Why him? He's the youngest. He can't even take care of himself. He's so little. And we're all, وَنَحْنُ عُصْبَةٌ, we're this big gang, Dad should be proud of us. Why does he get most of his love? You know? This is a human tendency. Number two, so that's one thing, right? The second issue with accepting just another human being and saying, why didn't an angel come? If an angel came, it would have been so much more convincing. And then they asked, why not? There were so many other qualified candidates. If you picked one of the political leaders that we already are used to listening to, and on top of all of his popularity, he came around and said, by the way, God spoke to me last night. It would have been an easier transition because we're already used to his leadership, right? So that would have been a convenient evolution of that leader, right? And here you have an orphan who is not very wealthy. I mean, he comes from a noble family. He's not wealthy at all, as a matter of fact. And he's coming and making this claim, and you have to put yourself or appreciate the position he's putting himself in. A man invites the entire village to the mount, and gets up on the top of the mountain, gets their attention, the equivalent of that back in the days microphone, gets their attention, and then basically tells them, listen, do you guys trust me? If there was an army attacking from behind this mountain, would you take my word for it? They said yes, because he had credibility among them. Then he said, well, I'm going to use that credibility now to make a claim before you. I'm a messenger of God. You are going to rise again just as sure as you're going to die. You're going to be answering for your deeds. You know? And he makes the claim to be a messenger. What do you think the response of an entire crowd is going to be when they hear something like that? The first response is, you're insane. What happened to you? And no surprise, that was the response. So when somebody argues that the Prophet had political motives, or how do we know he had genuine motives or not? No one in their right mind is going to go one against an entire community with hopes of one day convincing the entire community and then having aspirations of world domination starting as it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. And to hear that you're insane day in and you're a liar, you're insane, you're a nuisance, you're a disappointment, and to have your own family just completely abandon you and do away with you. And so things aren't getting better over the years. They're getting worse and worse and worse. And the abuses that start with ridicule have moved on to insults, have moved on to physical abuse that you can't even retaliate against by God's command Himself. And then on top of that, revelation comes, you can't leave yet. Stay here, talk to the same crowd. You got to talk to the same crowd. I mean, I want you to understand, when people like blatantly just say, oh, these people came to be prophets so they can confuse the people and control them somehow. You know, religion being the opiate of the masses and all. Well, you know what? Why don't you drop the real opiate that you have in your hand before you have this conversation? You know, where you talk about the religion being the opiate of the masses. And very, very genuinely, I want to share with you, what the prophets go through, I don't think any of us can handle. Many of you have jobs, or you run a business, right? Or you're at school. You're not used to being insulted. Nobody gets insulted at their workplace and shows up the next day with a smile on their face, back to business as usual. It affects you. You can't eat that day. You might even think about quitting your job or filing a lawsuit, something, you know? If I spoke before a crowd and they booed me, I wouldn't go before the same crowd again. I'd find a different audience. I wouldn't have the stomach to do that day in and day out. And by the way, one last point about this issue of prophethood. When other people claim to be prophets, they call to themselves. Our messenger is calling to God. He's calling to sacrifice. And the biggest example of sacrifice is himself. It's not like he's speaking from this position of a throne. You ever seen these movies where the kings are on the throne and they send the soldiers into battle? Right? Who's on the front lines? The Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet himself. And if he's in a position of political leadership, his family should be doing well as the Muslim community grows. He should be doing pretty well for himself. His own daughter comes to him, radiyallahu ta'ala anha, and says, I'm hungry, I haven't eaten for 2 days. And he lifts his shirt and there are rocks tied to his belly and he says, it's been 3 for me. You know? And yet he makes sure the others are fed. This is our messenger. What alternative agenda? What alternative agenda? So the Qur'an's argument to the original, if you think you have a right to be skeptical whether he's a messenger or not, the people who lived within his midst have more of a right. You have to dig books to find some dirt on him. They live next door. They can find it on him. So what does the Qur'an issue as a challenge to them? إِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. You are committed to a very high moral character. That is a proof of the Qur'an. That's one of the main proofs of the Qur'an, of him being a messenger. Let them challenge your character. Let them say what they will about your character. To call him insane is to just, you know what that does, right? Oh, that guy's crazy, don't listen to him. That just means we're scared of what he's going to say. So instead of, before you get to hear a word from him, just dismiss what he has to say, right? Tune it out. Tune it out. That's not an intelligent way of dealing with conversation. Somebody's trying to talk to you and you say, you're just crazy. Stop. That's not a reasonable way to deal with conversation. The other, he's a liar. Okay, prove it. Quran says, Hatu burhanukum, go ahead, bring your evidences. It issued the invitation. So I tell Muslims, when Orientalists or sometimes certain overly enthusiastic leaders of other religions bring a whole barrage of attacks against Islam, welcome, because they are doing something Quran asked them to do. Quran said, Hatu burhanakum in kuntum sadiqeen. Bring your proofs if in fact you stand on the truth. Go ahead and bring it. Let's have it. Let's have this conversation. When Christians came from Najran to meet the Prophet ﷺ, and they were skeptical, is he a prophet or not? We've heard some things, seems like he confirmed some of our revelation, we want to see with our own eyes. Guess what? They stayed at the masjid for weeks, at the masjid, and they worshipped Jesus at the masjid for weeks. They worshipped as they would at the mosque. And they asked the Prophet questions and engaged in dialogue for weeks. And revelation came specifically to address their concerns. And that conversation happened in a very civil fashion. It can still happen now. It doesn't have to be rooted in hatred. It doesn't have to be angry and cynical conversation. It doesn't have to be a match. Islam is the conversation about religions is not a debate. This is the last comment I want to make. I know it's the end of the QA session. The conversation between people of faith should not be a debate. It should never be a debate. And let me tell you why it shouldn't be a debate. You know, and the last thing you want to have with somebody is a debate. Because the only thing following debate is animosity. Because debate by definition is a competition, right? One is going to win and one is going to lose. And even if I lose, or even if you lose in a debate, it may seem like you lost, it may seem like I won or whatever. Even if I lose and the other one had stronger evidence, a bigger argument, I got stumped, I got taken out, whatever it may be, you know what's going on in my head? The last thing I'm thinking in my head is, now that I lost this debate, I should accept what he's saying. That's not what you're thinking. You're thinking, what can I come up with next time for round 2 to get back at him even better? In other words, it increased you in your animosity towards the other. It made you even more opposed to a message. The thing to do with people, and when it comes to matters of faith, is conversation. Is civil, respectful conversation. Debate is not the Qur'an's way either. It isn't. It's discussion. It's conversation. It's healthy exchange. It's sincere counsel. It's sincere counsel. Yusuf alayhi salam is in prison. Joseph is in prison. The prisoners come to him. He doesn't say, hey, you guys look like a bunch of idol worshippers. Let me tell you, your religion is wrong. Why don't you prove to me your religion? No, he doesn't start like that. Guys, come here. I just want to talk to you. I come from a very noble family. My ancestry goes all the way back to Abraham. And we have this covenant with God I want to tell you about. They start with a message of commonality. You know, that's where they start. Even the conversation with the Christians in the Qur'an. And the Jews as well. قُلْ يَا أَهْلَ الْكِتَابِ تَعَالَوْا إِلَىٰ كَلِمَةٍ سَوَاءٍ بَيْنَنَا وَبَيْنَكُمْ. Come to a word that we find in common between us and yourselves. Why don't you come and have a conversation about what we have in common? أَلَّا نَعْبُدَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. That we will worship no one except God Himself, Allah Himself. Let's start with that. Let's have that conversation, you know. This is, and these comments you'll notice like on Facebook and other places or YouTube, people will put videos about Islam or like a lecture or something, and there'll be non-Muslim comments underneath like, you know, you blank, 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 I can't say it here. And I would never dirty my tongue with those words because Muslims don't use filthy language. Muslims don't use filthy language. Guys, they don't use filthy language. They don't even say anything close to filthy language. They don't even change its spelling to say, hey, I didn't say that. They don't do it. You know? And they say those things about Islam and the Prophet and the Quran, and then some Muslim in his spirit of jihad fi sabilillah responds, well, you kafir, let me tell you, you are a beep, 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 beep himself. That's not Islam. That's not da'wah either. I don't know what that is. That's two people that have no respect for themselves. That's what that is. You know? One of my nephews came up and asked one time, you know, he heard one of the filthy words that's common in society now. He heard it in school. He goes, what does that mean? And I told him that means the person who said it is very frustrated, but Allah has not given him the intelligence to express his emotions. And when someone's not smart enough to express their frustrations, they use these kinds of dirty words. These are words that just describe a lack of intelligence. That's what they're for. Allah made us smart people, and smart people don't use those kinds of words because they find it an insult to their intelligence. We have to have that attitude even when we're discussing faith. We should not insult our own and other people's intelligence. We can have civil conversation. Genuine questions can be asked and healthy conversation can be had. But if you come into a conversation with the idea of stumping another, outdoing another, pinning somebody down with your counter argument or this point that you found and say, aha, I gotcha, then you know what? You have better uses for your time. You really do. You need to get a life. You seriously need to get a life. If you have genuine curiosities, you want to figure out how does the Muslim mind work? How do they think about these things? That's a great thing. And Muslims also, don't ask insulting questions to your Christian and Jewish friends. Hey, Bani Israel guy, come here. I got to ask you something. How come you people hate the Prophet so much? Don't do that. That's ridiculous. We have to be respectful in conversation, both the non-Muslims with the Muslims and the Muslims with the non-Muslims. And I pray that these kinds of forums encourage that. That we can have, we don't have reservations in talking and speaking our mind, but also we maintain an atmosphere of mutually shared respect. Barakallahu li wa lakum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.